All right, we are live. Boom! It's Friday. I'm here again with my very good friend Dr. Charlie Fagenholz, and I brought him back on because I got some really good feedback from you guys about the interview with him. He's a really sharp guy, some really good insights on a lot of different things. And one thing I wanted to bring Dr. Charlie on for today was to talk about the V word, vaccines. It's a pretty hot topic right now. We've got with everything with COVID, we've got a vaccine, they're rushing the market. And suddenly this topic that has really not gotten a ton of mainstream attention is like front and center for everybody. And so I'm excited to have Dr. Charlie on. Thanks for coming on again, man.
Yeah, man, I wouldn't want to spend a Friday morning any other way.
So for those of you, for the people who didn't see the first interview and don't know your background, share a little bit about your background and your experience with vaccine injuries. And you just had a little one come into the world too, so I know this is an especially relevant topic for you.
100%. It's made me really dive in even deeper than I had before. If you didn't watch our last interview, our last podcast, I didn't go to chiropractic school to really dive into this type of work, right? I wanted to be more physical, very much the chiropractic way, all structure, a little bit of physical therapy, treating solely athletes. But then the universe has, different things for different people. And I started getting into helping people who have been failed on in other realms of medicine, essentially. And that pretty much has led into all types of toxins, right? Toxins make us sick, as D.D. Palmer would say. And one of the biggest ones that I was never really educated on was vaccines. And when I came into California years ago, it was a very hot topic then. It just wasn't all over the country like it is now because of COVID. So I started seeing people who would have these weird symptoms, and just like kids who would just change within a day or a month. And the thing that most kids had in common was it was post-vaccination. Okay. And there's so many different ones. So it wasn't just one, there's many, which is part of the problem, which we'll talk about. And it made me do my research. And, there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and a lot of stuff is buried on the internet. And you really have to do your research into some of the stuff. And it's a shame because people in Western medicine who have tried to come out against this, or at least just shed light on it, because it's your free choice. You can do the research, but if anyone tries to bring it up of the question of, are these safe? Is this for my child? Do the rewards outweigh the risks? Those doctors get buried. They get called quacks. They lose their license. They lose their job. I mean, it's unbelievable what some of these doctors have gone through. And we're going to talk about one of the first stories that I remember reading about was a doctor named Bernice Eddy. And I think this is a good time just to go right into that.
Get it, man.
Because Bernice Eddy is a story that if you've never heard of her story, look her up. She worked for the NIH in the 50s, and she was tasked with vaccine safety testing for the first polio vaccine ever. And as you know, polio is a big controversial topic. Whenever people talk about vaccines, the first thing that a pro-vaxxer comes up with is, well, what about polio? And the first thing is, anyone who knows anything about polio, back then it was really a water sanitation issue. And the vaccine was not introduced until polio was upwards of 95% eradicated. That's unbelievable if you really look at the stats of when it was falling off and when the vaccine was introduced. But Bernice Eddy's story on the polio vaccine is one that deserves light. And let's talk a little bit about that. So in 55, she was studying the Salk polio vaccine. And she found that when she would give this vaccine that was created to monkeys, that it started paralyzing her monkeys. And she told the NIH, we cannot come out with this vaccine. This is going to harm people. I literally have given it to monkeys and it's paralyzed them. Okay. So what do? They take it with a grain of salt. And Alton Oshner, another, I think he was a surgeon by trade, but I know he's a medical doctor at Tulane. He brings, also he was a stockholder in the vaccine company. Okay, so there's the financial aspect of it. He brings the vaccine to Tulane and starts telling them how safe it is when they question the safety of it. And he goes, it's so safe that I'll give it to my grandkids. He gave it to his grandson and his granddaughter. In 48 hours, his grandson was dead and his granddaughter was paralyzed for life. You would think that would stop them, right? They would see this.
Yeah.
But they hushed it. They pushed it to the side. They introduced it into the population, into America, and kids started dying. Kids started getting paralyzed, and kids started getting full-blown polio. And so what happened was a lot of people started stepping down from the NIH, and their names escape me at this time, but a lot of the heads of the NIH, Secretary of Health, I believe, started stepping down. So Richard Nixon had to rebuild the NIH, and at this point, they took Bernice Eddy and put her off of vaccine safety, but put her into studying influenza, where she met Sarah Stewart. Now, Sarah Stewart and her discovered that, first they discovered DNA recombinant, which is a huge field to this day. It's a medical breakthrough, right? And what they found was that viruses were able to transfer from species, so from animals to humans. And they started, Bernice Eddy was starting to go, her mind was starting to go, and she started taking the monkey cells that the polio vaccine was extracted from and found 40 viruses. So now she's going, we just injected, this is in 55 is when, or 56 is when they found that. In 59, she had done so much research that she goes, we literally just injected 200 million people full of a vaccine that had live polio viruses in it and 40 other monkey viruses that have the opportunity to cause tumors and cancer in people. And she goes, there will be an epidemic of cancer in this country in the next 50 to 60 years. Well, wow. 50 and 60 years later, what is one of the biggest killers? Cancer, right? And so the statistics are, this is what I wrote down so I didn't butcher them. 1 out of every 200 people will have cancer caused by SV40. SV40 was the 40th virus that they discovered in that sample of monkey tissue. And 15 cancer cases for every 1 case of polio prevented with their vaccine. Those aren't good odds.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not something to roll out to the public by any means.
Yeah, and I think, with this COVID vaccine being rushed, I think the question a lot of people have is on the safety testing, because there's so many steps being skipped right now, and very often when they test these vaccines, they don't even use a placebo.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they'll use a previously licensed vaccine or something that has the same adjuvants that typically cause the side effects. That way, when the control group and the test group both have the same side effects, they can say, well, it had nothing to do with the vaccine. And
exactly.
And that's raising a lot of questions and concerns. And thankfully, this issue is getting a lot of attention now. Do you think there's been an increase in side effects and, well, direct effects, really, related to vaccines, over the last year? Because it seems like we've been adding more and more and more to the schedule.
Yeah. So, I mean, anytime you're going to introduce more toxicity to the human being, you're going to have more effects, right? So, since 1986, you know that then the vaccine manufacturers were no longer held liable for any injury. And when people do, which is self-reported, when they do report vaccine injuries, they're taken to a special court, right, which have paid out over $4 billion since that time period. And where does that money come from? Our tax dollars. So this is an issue financially that people should really care about, because it's coming out of our pockets. And the more that they introduce, as you're asking, the more there's going to be effects. And there's going to be like a COVID rush vaccine, things like that, where it's like, oh, well, there's no incentive for safety. I mean, maybe there is a little bit. I mean, I don't know the people personally, and I don't want to judge people, but I am judging the system a little bit when I talk about this. And And it's, if you're not held liable for something, how much time and effort are you going to put into really researching it before you introduce something that has significant financial gains?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the human condition, right?
Yeah, and I think that's so spot on. I don't like to assume people's motive, when they're doing this research, but you just have to ask questions about the system that's in place that they're working within. Mm-hmm. Right? If you take away liability from a company and say you're not responsible if your product hurts somebody, well, right out of the gate, I'm going to start asking some serious questions about safety. If you look at cars, this is an example that I like to use. Is if there was a car that had some kind of faulty design and it was driving down the road and every few of these cars is going to explode, right? I want to know that I can sue the manufacturer. And when they start having to pay out lawsuits, they're going to start putting more effort into making their cars safer, making sure the world knows they're safer, right? But if there's no liability there and I can't sue them, what incentive do they have?
Right.
And on top of that, when you add a mandate on top of that, where you must take this vaccine, right? Imagine, let's say a car brand, 3 out of 100 cars explode, just out of the blue, right? Well, if there's no mandate, look, they may not have liability, but at least I can say, well, I'm going to drive something different. I'm going to drive a different brand of car. I'm going to take the train. I'm going to take the bus. I'm going to ride a bike. I'm going to do something different. But when you have the mandate there, you take away choice. So there's this lack of liability and the inability for people to choose something different. And so the system is really set up to make it very easy. They have both an avenue and an incentive to not do the safety studies.
For sure.
And I'm not going to make assumptions about the character of the people doing the studies, but the system is really, it's a bad system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And you talk about effects. Another big talking point that I try to communicate with patients and when I talk on podcasts, things like that, is the big thing that people talk about when you hear vaccines is vaccines and autism, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, that's the conversation that people want to have. And yes, that has to happen because there, as I'll talk about in a second, there's a big thing to that. However, I also think that putting all the energy into that conversation takes away from the other effects like food sensitivities, other hypersensitivities, ADHD, like so many different things that are brought on by toxicity that we need to shed light on that too, because it's not just autism. I know that might kind of rub some people the wrong way. And I'd say autism is the most intense version of effects, essentially, because what autism at the core of it is someone who is not able to process toxins properly, right? They can't excrete them properly. And one of the biggest neurological signs is they're in a hypersensitive state with something called a microglial cell, which is just a cell in the nervous system that if it's upregulated is basically brain inflammation. And one of the things that is studied as post-vaccine is microglial cell activation. So you have something that causes something that's very associated with autism and autism spectrum type things. So the conversation has to be had, but don't let it take away from all the other day-to-day things that we experience, like emotional shifts, food sensitivities, attention span, headaches, digestive disturbance. I mean, all of this stuff is caused by toxicity. So it doesn't just stop at autism. And I think that conversation also has to be had as well. Yeah.
And even autoimmunity. We've seen just this massive increase in autoimmunity, and that conversation just isn't happening. And I think if you're going to look at autoimmunity, you have to look at the one product that's designed to fundamentally change your immune system for the rest of your life. And
great point.
And instead they're looking at, well, let's see if we can find the gene. They're always looking for the genes. It's like, look, you don't have genetic.
Yeah, it's an excuse essentially. They want to blame it on genetics so much.
Yeah, and you don't have genetic epidemics.
No.
If it's purely genetic, you're going to have a pretty steady level of the same number of people or same percentage of the population having something. You don't see these explosions of it. And so, at the very least, we need to start asking better questions. And one thing that a lot of people say to me when I have this conversation with them is, if this was such a big deal, if people were being harmed by these, we would see it on the news. This would be such a huge story. It would blow up. And what a lot of people don't know is that, one, this industry is incredibly powerful and influential, not just over the news, but over your politicians, right? They outspend oil and gas 2-to-1 in lobbying. And some would say, and this is not necessarily my personal opinion, but some would say that we fought wars in the name of oil, right? What does double that amount of lobbying power get you as far as policy on vaccines? I mean, that's a lot of money. Oh, yeah. And then when you add on top of that roughly 70% of advertising dollars to your mainstream media in non-election years, right, comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Not only are they controlling policy, but they're also controlling what you hear about policy from the media. So I think it's really important that people really be aware of that and know that if you want information on this, you have to look for it. It's not going to just fall into your lap. What are your thoughts on that, man?
Oh man, the media. I mean, I think that by this point, people can see how the media can twist something any which way they want to have you see it, right? So something like that, where the people who basically fund the media, right, why would they want like light shed on their evils, right, or their in their operations? Mm-hmm. So you're really not going to see it on mainstream media at all. I mean, it's one of my favorite quotes, Eugene Esco said, "Enlightenment lies in the question, not the answer." So as you were saying that, questioning is everything, and you really have to do your own research because you're not going to see it on our mainstream media. And in other countries, a lot of countries don't even let drug commercials on their television, and they call American TV propaganda. I mean, literally,
I think it's just the U.S. and New Zealand, I think, are the only two countries in the world that are allowed to advertise drugs on TV.
Even just thinking about that, like, do we need to say more? Right? Yeah. That's pretty unbelievable to think about. And I started taking a couple weekdays off, so I actually sometimes turn on the TV, and it's like every other commercial is something for a drug, mm-hmm. and the whole commercial is the side effects. Mm-hmm. Just like, I don't know. I don't get it. I don't get how it's just not, how there's some people who still believe that it's like a magical pill after seeing all these side effects. It's funny to me. And people don't know what they don't know until they find out they didn't know it. So you can't really hold them. I like to hold people accountable, but the average American who's watching television, which is to tell a certain vision, I don't blame it, because if I didn't know that this stuff existed, I'd probably be the same thing. But you gotta start questioning at some point.
Yeah, and I had some parents reach out to me and if they do their research, if they weigh the benefits, the risk, the alternatives, and they decide that this is something they don't want to do, how do they legally decline? One? And I want to throw a banner up on the screen here. So the National Vaccine Information Center is a really good resource for people, because that's a tough question to answer because it varies state to state. Every state has different policy on that. We're in California, which is probably one of the more draconian states when it comes to exemptions and things like that. But if you go to nvic.org, there's a lot of really good resources for what's legal, what's illegal in your state, really what your rights are. So I would highly recommend going there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of the safety testing that happens with these vaccines that a lot of people don't know about. They're not really placebo tested before they go to market. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's two things that I think are pretty crucial to understand beyond there's no liability to the manufacturers. That's a huge thing. Just that alone, I think, should really make everyone question. Right? You could be pro-vaccine, but you should still question that, because that's dangerous. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to safety testing, you talked about the control groups. And the control groups, the only difference is that they take the virus out of the vaccine in the control group. They still inject all the stuff that's causing most of the issues, the types of metals, the types of chemical fillers. There's peanut oil, there's high allergen type foods and things like that in these vaccines. And that's why when children are allergic or sensitive to chicken, eggs, and peanut, my mind immediately goes to that's vaccine induced, because those three are used in all the vaccines. So there needs to be a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, and it needs to happen over years, because the second point that I always bring up with studies is they only look at the children post-vaccine for, I've heard, 48 hours to 4 days. And then after that, if there's no reaction, then it's deemed safe. But in the population that I've seen, things don't happen overnight. Things happen over some time. The sweet spot is about 30 days to 2 months that I've seen personally. Other people have other stories where, it took longer than that, or some overnight. And the majority is within 30 to 60 days. So if a study is not following kids at least for that long, you're really not asking the right questions. But there needs to be a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. And I want to say I was reading one, maybe out of Germany. It's been a while since I looked at it, but I remember not thinking that it was long. There was something that I was like, they could have done this a little longer, a little better in some aspect. But it would take, decades, I personally think, because a lot of the viruses in vaccines, a lot of the chemical makeup of vaccines are slow acting in the nervous system. So just because you don't get a reaction within the first 2 months does not mean that something 30 years down the road is not caused by that neurotoxin that they injected into you. And it's I feel like science is always, well, if you did this here and it didn't happen at this point, there's no correlation. That doesn't cause that. And I think that is also a disservice, because these types of neurotoxins can take years to manifest, and also can weaken your epigenetic expression, right? The way your genes express so harshly that, but slowly over time, and cause something in life that you wouldn't really correlate the two. And I think that's a conversation that has to be had as well.
Yeah, that's huge. And what you said about allergies is so, it's so important, because what's an allergy? An allergy is an overactive immune system. That's your immune system mounting a response to something that really isn't dangerous to it.
Right.
And if you have some of these ingredients in a vaccine, and suddenly your immune system is going after these things, or you have an immune response, it seems like common sense to me that they would be related.
Yeah.
Does that seem like common sense to you?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sean, I want to give you the last word, man. I know we could go on for hours on this subject. I know I could. It's just it's such there's so much there, just from the poor research standards to the way the political system is set up around it, to the vaccine court where the pharmaceutical industry doesn't pay out the liability. There's just so much here. You get into the science, the politics, the industry. But what's your last word for people? What do people need to hear about this subject? What's the most important thing that you think people need to hear about this and need to really think on as they make decisions?
Yeah. So I think that is a huge thing. What you ended off with is the decision making. I am not for vaccinations. I don't want to project that onto a parent, essentially. I want them to make informed decisions. I want them to read the research and really dive in, and don't just listen to your primary care physician who in school learned from an institution that is funded by the people who create drugs and vaccines. Do your research. I think starting with Bernice Eddy's story is a pretty good one, because that's right when it all pretty much started, and then it'll take you down that rabbit hole, and you'll get a lot of good research from there that will make you think maybe a different way. I would encourage people to also keep an open mind. Keep an open mind, because a closed mind will not accomplish anything. And I also want to tell people that if you have had experience with any type of vaccine related issue with your children or you, that it is never too late to proactively do something to help your body to adapt. And the saying I like is that people don't grow out of stuff. They just grow into new things. What do I mean by that? That's kind of like if a child has a tendency to bang their head against the wall. Immediately the parents usually go, well, hopefully they'll grow out of that when they're this age. And that's something like that is a neurological issue that has to be addressed. So they will not grow out of that. They will just grow into something else. It might be a attention span, just something going out their attention span. It might be chronic headaches. It's going to turn into something else at some point. So it's never too late to proactively do something if the damage has been done by vaccines already. And there is lots that can be done. The human body is super intelligent, and when you do the right thing at the right time, miracles can happen. So it's never too late, but before it even gets too late, keep an open mind, do your research, reach out to someone like Dr. Casey or myself. We can point you into the right direction of what to read, what to look at, and then you can make a decision. Because let's talk about children. Your child is your child. You have free will. I believe you should have free will to do what you want with your child. And if you choose to vaccinate, then vaccinate. But don't mandate all vaccines for people who have done the research and are not comfortable giving it to their child because they see that the risks way outweigh the rewards.
Yeah, and I am going to throw up one more question on the screen that is probably on the screen here because it's from Teresa here. And she was just curious about resources. What resources does a layperson have to access to research their own online about vaccines, PubMed? So there's a few really good resources. One of them is the National Vaccine Information Center. I'm going to throw that link back up on here. This will give you information about the exemption policies in the different states. There's a few books that are really, really good that I really like. One of them is called Vaccine Safety Manual by Neil Z. Miller. I don't know if you've seen that one, Dr. Charlie, but I really like that one. It's written for doctors, but anyone can read it. It lists it gives you the background of the vaccine, the background of the disease, research on both, and you can really look at both and make an informed decision. It does that for every single vaccine on the schedule, so you can go one by one through that entire book. Another one that's really good is Vaccine Epidemic by Louise Kuo-Habakus. I think that's how you pronounce her name. That book is, it's thick, it's dense, and they address the political side of it, the legal side of it, the scientific side of it, and every little section is written by that type of expert. So the legal piece of it's written by a lawyer. There's so many different authors in that book. That's a really good one. Do you have any good resources, Dr. Charlie, that are your go-tos?
So you pretty much hit it on the head with those two. One more that I would talk about is the book that I helped write that's coming out in September called Autism Reimagined with Jody Mezchuk. It's a rewritten version of her first book, and it takes you through the journey of her son being vaccine injured and then the process of reversing that diagnosis with chiropractors, medical doctors, so many different types of practitioners. And she talks about a lot of stuff that would answer those types of questions. It's going to be, I'm excited for it because it really sheds light on the process of this happened. We went through this system. This is what this system said. Then we went this way. It's like an autobiography kind of. And that would be one that I would also read because it's very digestible as well. And, sheds some good light.
It's great, man. Well, guys, this has been a good conversation, Charlie. I appreciate you coming on and doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. And as you guys know, censorship is alive and well when it comes to natural health topics, especially this one. So if you find this valuable and you know someone who needs to hear this, which is everybody, I would encourage you and just really recommend that you share this, that you send it to them. Help this information get out, because people need to hear this. People need to be making their own informed decisions. They need to be digging deep on this issue so they can make the best decisions for themselves and their families. Because ultimately, the person who's responsible for your health and your well-being is you. You have final say on what goes into your body and what doesn't. And this topic is going to become more relevant over the next few months. We're really going to see this, I think, come up big time in media. And you want to make sure you know your stuff and you can stand your ground on the issue. So, Dr. Charlie, thank you, man. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have another topic and a nice little Friday morning.
Absolutely, man. All right, guys, have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.